Hi, I'm Angela Wolf, fashion designer and online instructor, and we're getting to the end of our jacket sew-along. So today, we're going to talk about top stitching and some finishing details on the hem. Okay, so first off, I just made a mini front of the jacket, similar to what we sewed earlier, but I think it's easier for you to see this. So I wrote right side, one side's the facing. If you didn't do this yet on your facing, you're going to go back and trim with your scissors slanted like this all the way down and around the neckline. Turn it back out and press. And before I go to the sewing machine, I just want to point something out. You always want to be top stitching from the right side of the garment. And again, my favorite stitch is the triple stitch, which you can actually see on here if you look closely. So you need that to show up on the right side. So what I do is where the jacket is going to fold back, which is what we call a roll line, all right? I'm gonna just use my pen here. I wouldn't do this on the garment, but you can if you want. This erases in 24 hours, hopefully. So I wanna stitch my double stitch on this side and then on this side. And one more thing is on here, have you ever seen the nice stitching? I could just stitch all the way to here and back up, but instead I'll write this with a pen so you can see. That's how the stitching is going to go. One more thing I usually do, I usually take chalk and I mark my 45-degree angle at each collar point. Because then when I'm stitching, I will know with the sewing machine to stop right here, turn, and go. All right, so let's go to the sewing machine. The first thing that you're going to want to do, if you haven't done this yet, is understitch. Understitching keeps the facing to the wrong side of the fabric. I do this on the front edge. So you can't get your sewing machine all the way to the top, so I start just a little ways down, and what I'm doing is I'm finagling the seam allowance toward the facing side. And just use a stitch. You're about 1/8 of an inch from that pressed fold. And just a very small stitch length, 2.5 is fine. And you'll stitch all the way to the bottom of the jacket. I usually leave a little bit at the bottom so it doesn't interfere with the hem. So see how that keeps the facing, or the seam allowance to the facing side? Now when I flip it this way, that will always stay to the back. Just a little tip there, even if you're not top stitching. All right, so top stitching, let's see. This is why my chalk marks are so great. Now I know that I'm going to do double stitching on this side from here up. So go to your triple stitch. I like, again, to put my needle in the center position. If your machine will allow you to do that, it just makes it easier for me, personally. And change your stitch length to 4.0. It just looks a little more polished. And I'm just gonna stitch with, I basically am lining up the edge of the fold with the inside edge of the foot. And then the other thing is, because this is the side that's gonna be folded back, what I'm doing is making sure that my underpiece here is kind of pushed to the back, okay? You don't want that seam to be rolled to the front. Stitch all the way. This is the same top stitching technique that I use for the belt loops. I use this on my jeans. If you've watched me on other episodes of It's So Easy, you know it's one of my favorite. So I noticed that that's a little bit too close. I'm gonna go one more. Now that looks a little better. When you get to the edge, if you're having a problem stitching, you want your stitch to be nice and even, you can always push this black button up to keep your foot even, or you can use threads to pull your fabric, but this usually works pretty good. And then it just pops off and you keep stitching. I'm gonna stitch to that mark I just made. I'm gonna do this one by hand now, just because you go back and forth 3 times. And what I'm doing is stitching right inside of that edge of the seam. This gets a little tricky with the triple stitch, but it's worth it. All right, and now I'm gonna stitch to the edge. Again, to the marking that I have there. Oops, I went one past, but you get the idea. And then just continue to stitch. So you would stitch this all the way around the collar, down the other side of the facing to this point. So I'm just going to stop there and give you a look and then show you how to finish the rest. So you imagine this is your jacket, the right side. This folds back. If you can see that stitching in a contrasting color. Now from this side, I'm going to go back and start about almost an inch into where I was before on the exact same seam line, because this is now the right side of the garment. Again, using that about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. This looks really nice if you do 2 rows of stitching as well. All right, I think you're getting the idea. So this is the right side of the garment, and this folds back. So just a quick, those are just tips for doing top stitching. What about the hem? So here I have a jacket that I've already finished pretty close to the same way as the other jacket. I just changed one thing. I added a facing here, but it would be exactly the same process. So I wrapped bias tape across the edge, just like we did in the belt loop episode. But notice that these areas are open. So one tip for hemming, I have this right here. Let's just pretend that this is a seam and this is your hem. All right, your hem would be turned up about 2 inches. I always give it a good pressing. Let's go back to the sewing machine for a second. So just like we did with the belt loops, I'm going to change back to a straight stitch, about a 3.0 stitch length. Just stitch. Now again, you don't have to use a facing like I did on that orange jacket, just sometimes it's a little bit of a richer look. But this would be how I did the blue jacket, where the hem is just folded up. So there's your edge. You'd fold this under. Give it a good pressing and stitch. I'll just do a little piece so you can see it. Again, you can always go back to the belt loop episode to see this. I'm just tucking this under, but I want to mention one thing. In the belt loop episode, remember I used a 2-inch wide bias strip? This is that 1-inch wide. This is the reasoning. See how that just barely covers it? It doesn't take up any extra bulk when it's silk or cotton like that. So that would be finished all the way down. Now, if this was the inside of your jacket, these would be serged or finished. Press this up, and this is how I tack my seams, my hems. Because you have interfacing, you really don't need to hand stitch all the way around. On that blue jacket, I actually did top stitching because there was so much room. But if it's close together, this is how I would hem the sleeve, for example. Hold your finger in place and just hold, you're holding the seam allowance to the edge of that hem. It's a little tricky. I'm trying to do it to keep my hands out of the way so you can see. And I'm just going to do it back and forth. It's almost like a little bar tack. So see how that holds that in place? All right, now on the other jacket, which I'll show you the back, but let me just press this, give you a few more tips here for finishing your jacket. All right, so this is where it was tacked. Let's compare that to this jacket here. I have tacking right here on that seam, right here. This is wide open. These, if it's only 3 or 4 inches, this will stay up because of the interfacing. Now let's look at the back of this jacket. You can see I have top stitching on there. Again, the reason I did that is because I can't just tack the one side seam over here and this one over here because it would fall down. So I just did a nice top stitching. It looks great. You can see the inside is finished like this. And if I go back over here to the side, you'll see this is where that tacking is. So I even still tacked it even though we did the top stitching. And if you could take a closer look at the sleeve, on the inside of the sleeve, you can see the interfacing. You can see this part here. I tacked right here. and I tacked right here. So one of the last things that you'll need to do is add your belt straps, which you can see here. And all I've done with those is folded them in. Now I could trim this off, and this is actually what I usually do when I'm finished, is I folded those in about, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch. It's just easier to keep it out of the way. And then fold this up and just trim. And that way you won't be able to see it. One tip is when you're attaching these, you can sew the first, I have 2 rows of stitching here. You can actually sew that first row, trim, and then sew the second row, and then that would enclose that raw edge. So where do I put these? I put these on each side seam. If I was going to have a center back seam like on this jacket, now this one doesn't have belts, but I would actually put belt loops on the center back and each side seam. The other thing is on the sleeve, if you haven't done it already, you would attach these to the sleeve because this is what holds that belt in. So now that we've finished the entire jacket, let's take a look at what's on the inside of this jacket. All right, get everything out of the way. So this is everything that you've been sewing that I'm showing you on small samples. You can see the back facing. There's that sleeve head I was talking about. So after I inserted the sleeve, I actually attached bias binding around there. Here's the facing. You can see I have the bias binding on the edges. If you look closely, you can see my top stitching. And you can see the back side where I switched it and went all the way down to the bottom, just like I was showing you. Let's see what else is in here. A closer look at the patch pocket that I just put onto the jacket and did top stitching. And here's a closer look at the belt. The facing on the inside, and I just did again top stitching around. So that's how easy it is to make this very simple jacket. In the next episode, I'm going to give you a few tips if you decide to add buttons, but if not, your jacket should be finished.